Hi, everybody. I thought it would be nice for those of you who were unable to attend live class to just go ahead and do a digest for you of the topics. I figure many of you may be also like having to watch multiple of these sort of recorded videos from different profs on campus. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about urban forests and try to digest a bit of what we talked about both from the online community and then also from the students who attended class. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right now and just want to sort of talk about this question of why do urban forests matter? So during this time in class, students sort of shared what they thought were some of the really surprising points. So for example, I believe someone said that they thought it was really interesting that most of the urban forest is actually in private ownership and only a small proportion, in fact, is like what we see as street trees or things that are maintained by the cities. Let's see, there were a variety of other sorts of things that people mentioned, but we also just sort of talked about the fact that in general, forests have a lot more to offer than just carbon sequestration. And they really are pillars to human well-being in urban settings, right? So they sequester carbon, but they provide shade. They are noise pollution, air pollution barriers. They, are really important in terms of cycling water, right? So one of the things that we talked about was that now that we understand transpiration, for example, not only are trees important for intercepting water and preventing runoff onto impervious surfaces like roads, but trees also are important for cycling water, right? So for drying, so one of the reasons why they're intercepting that water, not only are they like holding it in and letting it percolate into the soil, but they're also like recycling it to the atmosphere. And so all of these different things are really important for people, right? And for human well-being. And so those of you that have taken my sophomore seminar on environmental studies, you know that I study a lot about social ecological systems. And so urban forests, of course, are also social ecological systems in which, the forests really are entirely contained within this human community, right? And so the environment is very much regulated by people, and the tree also, of course, in its vigor and ability to provide those ecosystem services is also regulated by both the community and the biophysical environment. Well, all of those things are really, have to be managed by institutions at the community level, and then there are all these sorts of interactions, right, that are thought of as these benefits to humanity, right? And so I also wanted to sort of contextualize quickly how we might think about where we are in terms of this class and in terms of talking about forests. So up until now, we've kind of talked about these like more rural or natural settings, right? Or like Wadsworth State Park might be one of these sort of more rural areas, more pristine, right? And then we've also talked about sort of growing trees for timber, very highly managed, right, versus the unmanaged. But then sort of when we think about the urban matrix, vacant lots or neglected trees, those are the sources of natural regeneration. And then of course you have these urban green spaces, right, which represent a large proportion of the urban forest matrix. But then, then that goes from sort of these neglected spaces, right, to these very well maintained shade trees and yard trees and things like that are also very costly. And so we discussed as well this idea that, I've sort of talked about the top panel here already in terms of thinking about the benefits of trees. And of course, students also really notice, for example, the benefits of trees in terms of intercepting solar radiation. One of the things that is really interesting is that if we look at, there are a number of papers that use land surface temperature data, eco-stress land surface temperature data, for example, that are looking in the cities of Phoenix and Los Angeles, and at land surface temperature at a 70-meter resolution pixel. across a city, and then looking at the sociodemographics of those same populations. And so what we know is that during heat waves, in Los Angeles, for example, because ecostress allows you to get nighttime temperatures. Remember, it has that precessing orbit, so it gets images from different times of day. So the nighttime temperatures are very, very high in communities of color and low-income communities. This contrast, of course, is that daytime land surface temperatures can be up to 20 degrees different in Phoenix, Arizona, in affluent areas versus low-income communities of color within Phoenix. And so that's really important in terms of a water limited system. So of course that is all tied to things like trees, right? And so so when we look at this graph, you can see not only are trees sort of ameliorating site conditions, but they're also, you know, ameliorating things like the heat island effect, right? And then also creating havens for biodiversity. And so, but then none of this comes without a cost. And so one of the things that's also really interesting is that trees don't really become a benefit until they're about 30 years in age. That's when they become a carbon sink rather than a carbon source. And so I asked the class if they knew why that was. No one said anything. Until finally someone said, well, there's these costs of the stuff on the right in the graph. And then I said, well, also, there are all these fossil fuels emissions associated with the rearing of the plants, the planting of them, and then, you know, even the watering, but also, you know, and then I mentioned how the landscaping business around Wesleyan is constantly going out there with their weed whacker or something. So that's one of the reasons why there's not a lot of benefit until trees are about 30 years old. At the same time, very large trees have lots of benefits, but then it costs a lot of money to remove them. Then we sort of moved on to talk about the reading directly and just sort of explaining the fact that if we look here in the top left corner and we look at the history of redlining and racial segregation in a city, and this has been looked at many times, in fact, not just in this article in Baltimore. But what we see is that in those communities, there are low healthcare services. There's also less money, right? And so there's less money. This is the wealthy neighborhood on the outside, and then the red neighborhood is on the inside. So you have redlining, therefore you have systemic racism. And then what that ends up happening is that you have a loss of landscape heterogeneity, right? And so in this more affluent area, you still have streams or a large canopy cover, whereas in these areas where there aren't a lot of services, there are also fewer ecosystem services, right? And so that results in a depauperate species matrix, right? Versus in these more affluent communities where you have more variety of habitat types, you also have higher biodiversity, right? So we can think of this in terms of not only you know, degradation of human well-being, it's also a trophic cascade. So that's one of the things we talked about in class. And then, these are all from the article, but you might not have seen them because they were sort of buried at the end. And I sort of discuss the difference between environmental justice and social justice. The social justice movement really came out of the civil rights movement, right? Whereas the environmental justice movement really came out of a different group of people responding to these environmental contaminants in these disproportionately poor Black and Brown communities. And so there wasn't necessarily quite an alliance between those. And I explained, this is just sort of a brief history of the environmental justice movement. But the idea being that we spent a lot of time looking at the bottom of this panel where we're looking at this structural racism and classism and things like gentrification. So of course, discussed gentrification as displacement of local communities due to rising property values, right? But this idea of, this phenomenon of structural racism and classism that's embedded within urban cultures and the spatial distribution of wealth and resources is really embedded in the human component, which then sort of moves up to look at then, of course, human health, but then also ecosystem health. And then, indeed, if you have sort of two different cities where one is city number one, where, in all places, lots of green patches are good, because they're where there's forest cover and there's highest species richness, right? The number of species at a particular site. And then, however, in these more redline communities, right, in both of these cities, what we see is fewer species in these places. So a more simplistic food web and a trophic cascade. So, so how do you measure forest health? So most of these studies are basically taking gridded satellite derived data of canopy cover, and then they're relating it to a suite of socioeconomic or socio-demographic variables. So one thing I wanted to mention, which I forgot in class, was that I really got interested in urban forests when this summer, in fact, working with Jordan Green, who's a junior student of mine. And, he and I did a literature review of urban forests and environmental justice. So, this is all new stuff that I've really learned since the summer. But I think it's a really important issue, right? And so if we're going to sort of think about equity and justice in the context of forests, up till now, we've really talked only about places that are these like sort of locked up resources that are public or private lands that many people don't have access to. So another point that I made in the lecture today in class was that urban forests, to some degree, are the only forests that some people ever have contact with, right? And so so that's really, really important, especially when we're losing canopy cover over time in these forests. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But so how do you measure tree canopy cover? Well, the National Land Cover Data Set is actually derived from Landsat imagery. And essentially what it's measuring is on a 30 by 30 meter pixel, which is what Landsat satellite imagery is. It's measuring the percent canopy cover within that pixel. I also want to sort of emphasize the fact that these models, so this is a multivariate model. And so some of the stuff that Jessica talked about, for example, last week with those maps that she showed, those were also very sophisticated multivariate models. And so she and I and others sort of use these models to try to do things like this. So take Landsat imagery and then try to build a model of canopy cover. And so how was that done? Well, that was done using FIA data, forest inventory and analysis data, which is from the Forest Service. There's thousands of these plots all over the US. Their location is hidden from the public, but just recently you're actually able to download them and get some coordinate data off of them. But basically what they've done is create a canopy cover map. And so that gets intersected with socio-demographic information. And, what we really see is that idea of the luxury effect, right? And so the fact that canopy cover is greater in these areas with high income families, white families, et cetera. And I'm going to show you some more examples of that as we move forward. So this is an example of how you might monitor tree canopy cover change over time, right? And so in this is also a Landsat image. It's not a canopy cover data set, but in red, what we see is vegetation. And so this is in 2007 in panel A. Panel B is in 2015. And then the change, of course, is quite dramatic. And that's shown in purple in C. So you can understand how change over time is really, something that we can monitor from these canopy cover data sets, and then we can try to understand like why that is. And then I showed everyone this, since when have trees existed only for rich Americans? And this is, excuse me, an article that came out, let's see, in this year. And I'm just trying to get to the website here. Excuse me. And so what you can see here is, in fact, If we go into Philadelphia to an affluent area, see very high canopy cover in these forests, right? And then the median household income is $133,000, right? Whereas just 5 miles away, very little urban canopy cover in an area where the household income is just roughly $37,000. $37,000 per year. And so, these areas were redlined, limiting investments and economic growth because of the racial makeup. And what we see is that these practices still shape our cities today. And so, rich Americans enjoy almost 50% more greenery in their environment compared to lower income communities, right? And then this is the graph, and what you see on that I showed in the PowerPoint presentation, which is that, in areas that have low medium incomes on the left, you see very little canopy cover versus median incomes on the right. Again, this is using aerial imagery, right? And then these are the graphs sort of showing the change, right? And so I just finished up with another statistic here, sort of saying that in predominantly white areas, tree covers cover 1/3 of the surface. In communities of color, it's barely 1/5. So with that, I started to talk about sort of this other methodology, which is what you watched the video about, iTree. And I'm sorry to leave spectral reflectance as a leftover from a different presentation, but iTree, it's a web app, and we're going to go out and use it next week. And essentially, we can go out and we can take things like diameter data and some other data about distance to buildings, things like that. We'll all use the app. It even works for Android, Kieran, and then it provides this like nutritional label that tells you how much carbon, etc. Of course, it's generated by, you take the diameter of the tree, and then it uses an allometric equation to actually solve for the amount of carbon. So we'll experiment with that. And then also, I mentioned that next week, the plan for class is the following. So Tuesday, one more iTree slide. So we've used iTree in some British places, in Bristol, Leeds, and other, but what they've done is they've been able to actually quantify the ecosystem services. So as you saw in the video, it's not just about carbon, but it's about, like, for example, how much water are trees keeping back from going into runoff on impervious surfaces, and all these, how much pollutants are they alleviating, etc. So iTree is actually we're going to take a very simple set of the data, but you can use it on city data. You can use GIS layers. You can use all kinds of different sorts of records and pollution data to try to estimate urban forest health. And so with that in mind, next week I will be giving a more traditional lecture on Tuesday, which is basically about diversity. I've already posted the reading, talking about some sort of classical diversity estimation metrics. And then in class, we will, so that'll be Tuesday's class. I will be talking about estimating diversity. And then on Thursday, I will actually be using some iTree data from the city of Los Angeles, and creating some diversity graphs in R. And we'll go out and take some iTree data, and then we'll be spending a little bit of time on the forest ethnography projects. The main thing that I also sort of concluded with was really just to talk about the fact that I thought this was a really important topic to think about, because of the fact that we've talked so much about access to these sort of pristine places. And if we're going to think about regenerating forests and human well-being, and the fact that more humans on the planet are going to be living in urban spaces moving into the future, that this is a really important topic. And so ultimately then I left the conversation with everyone talking about sort of, what are some of the solutions to this problem, right? And so Ben brought up the fact that you really have to be careful when you think about gentrification. So for example, greening spaces in communities of color then leaves people vulnerable to gentrification. And so that is something that's really important to think about. And then Michael actually brought up the fact that, and then also Kieran, that there are some spaces in New York City, like Via Verde, in which these are sustainable building designs, residential developments in New York City. And both of them had taken Professor Joseph Seary's class. And so they both discussed the fact that this is mixed income housing. No one knows exactly what your income is. Michael talked about this green ribbon. And so we just sort of looked at this as one sort of set of solutions. This is a garden space, common garden space for community members. Of course, it's like LEED certified and all that. And then I mentioned as well that I had worked with Professor Seary and Professor Shelley Versi in a think tank a few years ago about urban spaces, in which I used GIS to actually identify that there are several hundred of these kinds of structures, right, which are sort of these redesigned, sustainable, mixed income housing structures in which they're looking at sustainable design features. It's very much a part of like the future. I think if we think about transformation and transformative adaptation, this is definitely an important pathway. But of course, it's about redesign, right? This is still a new space. The other thing that I discussed was that in my review of the literature over the summer was that really the municipal programs for tree planting are less effective than those done by NGOs. And I asked everyone what an NGO was, but they were all brain dead and ready to go on Thanksgiving by then. But an NGO is a non-governmental organization. And essentially those sort of grassroots community-based projects in which, these projects are really embedding with community members and really where community members are sort of thinking about what they want and things that they want moving forward are the most successful. But that also there are conflicts sometimes in terms of thinking about, like, so for example, if you want a fruit tree, community members want a fruit tree because it provides food, but then of course that becomes a mess, but also a slipping hazard for people on sidewalks. So there are these kinds of balances. And for that's mostly what we talked about today. The only other thing we discussed was also that young trees are really at a big cost because they have high mortality rates. So trying to get trees into that stage where they're urban street trees, where they're big enough to survive, is really important to get them into that carbon sink stage. So with that, I'll leave you all alone. Have a wonderful holiday, and I'm happy to discuss any of these concepts with you. Again, I just feel like this is such an important component for thinking about the future of our forests here in the US and elsewhere in cities across the globe. So thanks for your time. Bye.